is or can be bad. I think the voters should have a role in saying how their taxes are spent or whether or not it should be increased, and have their blessings to it. How that went about initially was because there were taxes that, in Colorado Springs in particular, that were set aside for capital improvements, and it was set to expire in a certain year by a certain time frame, and the council decided that they were going to extend it. Even though it was set aside for capital improvements, that they decided they were going to extend that tax. And even though it was not going to be more money than the citizens had already been accustomed to, the fact that they didn't have a voice and say yes or no to it, and no matter that they came to the council meeting and would express their views on whether or not it should be extended, the council still had the power. And that's what frustrated some of the people that started to advocate this taxpayer Bill of Rights. It's all of the other stuff that came in as a result of all those things that makes Tabor not quite so attractive to a lot of people.
And basically your citizens were saying that we have our elected officials making a decision beyond that power that we had given them in the original referendum, and they decided rather than end it as it had been stated that they were going to continue it. And as a result, that put that added burden on those taxpayers, because they were the ones who would be picking up the tab.
Well, it wasn't a referendum. It was, the council had said, these are the things that we need to do for capital improvement purposes. But we're only going to have it for a 5-year period. And when that 5-year period ended, was supposed to come to an end, council said, well, we still don't have enough to do our capital improvements that still need to be done for infrastructure within the city. So rather than to sunset it and let it go, we're going to say we're going to extend it again for another set period of time. And there were many citizens that said, oh no, that's not going to happen.
That we should have a say, we should say.
Right, and they did extend it, and then the initiative was brought forward, and
For the referendum.
And it said the taxpayers should have a voice, and that's what the voters voted on. So council, their action that they said to extend it, it failed, because the taxpayers' Bill of Rights went into effect.
So that actually was caused by the elected officials not listening to the taxpayers and the voters in terms of what it is that they wanted to have happen. Because actually, I would think that if they were have been able to make the case that it should be extended, then they may have brought into it. But it sounded like they weren't able to make the case, and even if had they been, there were strong enough voices saying, no, that's not what we want, that's not what we want. We want to have not only the voice, but the power to start it or stop it, to say yes or no.
And that's what frustrated, I think, some of the advocates for Tabor, is that they were saying, and it was all in presentation, I guess you could say, it was touted as being the taxpayer Bill of Rights and having a voice in how things would be voted upon. Your taxes cannot be increased without you saying yes or no. But it's the other stuff that was brought into Tabor. It's what they call log rolling. So that there's so many other things that are brought in when this one thing was the primary purpose of it.
So they tagged on some other.
Yes.
Amended it.
Yes. A lot of other stuff that really didn't have a lot to do with you saying yes or no to whether your taxes should be increased. That's where the revenue cap came in. That's where you talk about the inflation and all those things. It has nothing at all to do with whether or not you say yes or no to a ballot issue, or whether your taxes are increased. It dealt with property taxes. It dealt with communication taxes. It was a whole bunch of other stuff that was brought in that it convoluted and has the tendency to still convolute a lot of things. It had election provisions that were brought into it as well. And none of those things had anything at all to do with whether or not you said yes or no
Right.
to your taxes
When
being
it started out
increased.
being. So where you are now is you're having to live with a law that was passed that has been amended to in some respects, but it's causing all kinds of havoc in terms of the availability of revenue and the use of any revenue that's available.
It is still quite, it's hard for the city to make ends meet. And there's still cuts that have to be made in order to keep that balanced budget, as well as the lack of revenue. Now the revenues are starting to increase gradually, slowly, but it's not going to be at the level that it was 2 years ago or even a year ago. It's still just slightly above where we were a year ago, but it's not back to where we were in 2008 and 2009.
Now, moving from that into not just voters getting, because that's an example of where voters kind of took hold and said, we're not going to take it anymore, you know. And this is what's going to be. And then as that ball started rolling, then because it was rolling, people started adding some other stuff on there, which wasn't necessarily productive or useful, but it was what they ended up with. And in terms of people getting involved and people not just standing up and saying enough is enough, but speaking out and standing up for their rights and really thinking through the impact of decisions that are made, not just by their elected officials, but that the impact that of those things that are coming before their elected body, and what is it that they can, should, will do in regard to that proposed legislation. Did you find in your area that people did, women and men, did actually stand up, speak out, not just in terms of TABOR, because that became like a hot potato that started rolling, and then, when things get going, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. But in terms of your regular meetings, were there people that would come and actually speak up and, get involved and the like?
Oh yes, it did start to bring a lot of people out of the woodwork, and certain citizens probably more than others. They did start to speak up a little bit more, but I think that they're learning to work through some of those situations. That it's easier to sit down and talk with the council about certain kinds of issues that you want to bring forward, and in some cases, the council is willing to bring forward it, and you don't have to do an initiative or go out for a referendum on something that they've already passed. So I think that communication and working together
absolutely
is primary, and it's key to a city being able to maintain itself.
And you started off saying something about, which is kind of in line with what we're really saying, about the people were going to meetings and speaking up, speaking out, but they weren't paying attention.
They
elected officials.
They didn't feel like they were being heard.
Right. And that's really what we hear from people, local level, national level, all levels of government, where people saying they just don't feel like they're being heard, that there is that. And we've been saying this for years, that disconnect between what the people are saying and what the elected officials are hearing and doing. What the people are saying they want to see happen and what they actually end up, the elected officials actually end up doing. There is that feeling that, well, they put us in office, so we're going to do what we think is right, and then, like, dang the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And sometimes, that can turn out to work out okay, but more than likely it doesn't, because it ends up teeing people off and making them upset because they hadn't given you that authority to move forward and do what it is that you're going to do. And the bottom line is because the burden of that falls on them.
Absolutely. I think sometimes our elected officials take on the I am the Almighty and the most powerful, and I know what's best for you. And instead of actually listening to what the citizens are saying and how trying to meet some kind of, and I won't say compromise, but a win-win situation where you may not get everything that you want, but we won't get everything that we want, but everybody's going to be happy.
Absolutely.
Everybody's going to at least be happy with some of the outcome that comes out of all of this.
And that's why I hate using the word compromise too, because it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody, even though they say that somebody's going to win, but sometimes the one side might get crumbs and the other person ends up walking away with the cake, you know?
And really what I heard Kathy say was it wasn't authentic. It started out being this way, but the authenticity moved it to another way. And what I really like the idea of this is participation.
Right.
Because I always, for me, as an individual that does pay property taxes and pays a lot of sales taxes, I want to be heard. The difference is, listen to me. It doesn't mean you're going to do it my way, but the people like to be heard, and when an official acts like a god, and they're not willing to listen, all they're willing to do is talk, and I can see that there'd be some very good points to this situation, but they didn't listen.
No,
And either did, I'm not just talking about the officials, either did the people that voted it in, because they're only willing to hear their side. And to me, a government, the same, because a government is a relationship. If we don't have a relationship, we are never going to go further. And the key to a relationship is communication and shut up.
And
just listen, just listen.
And to be civil to one another.
Right.
Even though as a citizen, there are certain things that I would want government to listen to. It's all in the approach and how you bring things to your elected officials. When you approach the podium to talk to your elected officials, I mean, you don't have the barrier as soon as you walk up to the podium that I'm not even going to listen to this individual, let alone look at them. So whatever it is that they're going to say is already gone outside of my head, and I've already turned off my ears, so I'm not hearing anything that's coming out of your mouth.
Well, and to me, Kathy, and you can, maybe I'm wrong, but the fiber of trust comes from love. And love means that when you're walking up to the podium, you're doing it for the benefit of all people. And when you're not, and you're just in a selfish, self-centered, self-seeking way, then you cannot listen, because it's all about your wants.
That's right.
And in a relationship, it's to relate to each other so that the ship starts going in the right direction. And it's going to get stuck in a harbor, and it's okay.
That's right.
As it gets stuck, and there's God-fearing people, like our Constitution said, and I don't see that in a lot of elected officials.
I don't see it, and it's not just our elected officials,
Right.
but it's
Yes,
also in
both
some of our
ways.
citizens.
Yeah, it's
Right.
got to be both. Both
Absolutely.
sides have got to be respectful. Both sides have to be courteous. Both sides have to listen. Both sides have to be open to hearing each other and realizing that there is value that can come from listening to what that person has to say, that person in and of themselves have value, number one. But number two, that which they have to share, especially when they're passionate about it, it's coming from their heart. This is something that is causing them some pain, some anguish, or whatever else. And sometimes just listening
It's a key.
is a solution for them.
Just shaking your head, and I always say to people who are directing anger at me, I just say it very lightly. I don't do well with anger. And they usually hear me. And it's not like, oh, and the person listening to them, being able to be the same person and allowing that to go off of them, rather than take it personally. But if someone's coming up to the mic and gonna yell at me, I'm going to say, excuse me, that does not work. when you're willing to talk about this, I'm willing to listen.
Right.
When you're willing to
And
communicate
really,
about it.
and if they're really making personal attacks, that should be stopped. They should be stopped dead in their tracks.
Well, because what it is, to me, Gwen and Kathy, is